The issues of gender-based violence, domestic violence, prostitution, and sexual and labor exploitation are so intertwined that one concept cannot be discussed or fully understood without, at a minimum, recognition of the others. Each one is a piece of this puzzle of exploitation disproportionately affecting impoverished communities, but more factors are at play here. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services defines human trafficking as, quote, A, sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not yet attained 18 years of age, or B, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery, end quote. It is crucial to understand what human trafficking entails and working to address it, as different definitions produce different understandings and remedies of the issue. Furthermore, there is abundant misunderstanding of the term human trafficking, especially in believing that it specifically deals with the movement of people, which is not always the case. It is necessary to combat these misconceptions as they, quote, only further marginalize the most vulnerable in our communities, end quote. Human trafficking is a case of modern-day slavery, and with it, quote, currently there are more slaves in the world than at any other time in history, including when slavery was legal, end quote. This is a phenomenon that matters because people matter, and no world is just where people are enslaved. This issue matters to the study of poverty and inequality, as human trafficking exploits the most vulnerable, often those living in poverty, and disproportionately affects certain populations. It may be easy for upper-middle-class American families to lead their comfortable lives, quote, envisioning that slavery is long over because it was eradicated in 1865. However, over 27 million people are trafficked each year worldwide, and over 50% of victims who are enslaved are children, end quote. Even knowing this, many Americans assume human trafficking is a global issue, and there is little existence of it within our borders. But, quote, human trafficking plagues America as much and more than it does underdeveloped nations, end quote. It is imperative to understand the current climate of human trafficking where we live. What does human trafficking look like in the United States? To start with the numbers, there's estimated to be between 15,000 and 50,000 women and children forced into human trafficking each year in the U.S. However, these numbers are difficult to research, and another study conducted by the Department of Health and Human Services estimated the number to be between 240,000 and 325,000 people. The public opinion of these numbers is often that the people behind them are illegal immigrants, when in fact the majority of people trafficked in the United States are American citizens. Quote, human trafficking happens in every community in America, end quote. The demographics of this population of people who are trafficked varies, but estimates are up to 80% of trafficking victims are girls, with the average age of entering trafficking at 13 years old. Why does human trafficking exist? The simple answer is money. Theresa Flores, a survivor of human trafficking, states, quote, human trafficking exists based on economics. Business-minded people recognize or create a demand and then provide the supply, end quote. This is why it is so connected with poverty and inequality. While, quote, poverty is one of several factors that make individuals vulnerable to trafficking, and trafficking victims come from a range of backgrounds, trafficking is linked inexplicably with people with a lack of resources, end quote. Without eliminating these vulnerabilities, these communities will continue to be exploited. A powerful and frightening aspect of human trafficking is that anyone is susceptible. While certain populations are considered more at risk, no demographic is exempt. All racial, ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, gender identities, and religious affiliations are represented in the group of people who are trafficked. Knowing this, it remains valuable to recognize the groups most affected, because in targeting those groups in work against human trafficking, we would be targeting the majority of victims and survivors. In this identification, we can recognize that, quote, at its core, slavery targets society's most vulnerable, end quote. A large part of this vulnerable population are children, as they are, quote, far easier to deceive, threaten, coerce, force, manipulate, and blackmail than adults, end quote. Additionally, the most at risk for child sex trafficking in the U.S. are, quote, youth who have been molested or abused, runaways, and children from impoverished communities, end quote. It is these individuals who traffickers have the easiest time convincing that they have no other options. The Flores Project, which operates the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, published the top 5 risk factors for sexual and labor exploitation. Unstable housing was placed at number 3, behind substance use concerns and runaway homelessness for sex trafficking. For labor exploitation, self-reported economic hardship was ranked number 2, with recent migration relocation at number 1 and unstable housing at number 3. Since this is based on data collected through the hotline, it is clear that living in poverty and other conditions that may come with this greatly contribute to the likelihood of being trafficked. Traffickers may exploit the financial situation of an individual by promising a new job or a way to earn money fast. For people who are desperate and have no other options, it is easy to become prey. Not only do traffickers foster this exploitation, but there are social contributions and aspects of our society that perpetuate this exploitative culture. To begin, the mentality of the sex buyers or Johns is deeply problematic as they feel entitled to buying services from another person. In other words, forcing someone to do something they would have not previously done through payment. This is harmful as it reduces the autonomy of the trafficked persons, especially if they will be physically or mentally abused for not carrying out the act. Because there are people who will buy sex, there are people who will exploit others to supply this demand. As Theresa Flores put it, quote, when men no longer pay for girls, girls will no longer be victimized, end quote. Also, legislature represents an extension of society's beliefs, and as long as laws criminalize the victims and let the Johns free, the public opinion will continue to look down on prostituted women and rationalize the Johns' behaviors. Even drug dealers are moving into the ring of human trafficking as they can sell people many times over and often face less jail time on human trafficking charges than on drug charges. Society continues to sensationalize features of human trafficking, like dressing as a pimp and a hooker for Halloween, while failing to see the struggles and pain of these people and the additional damage that they are doing by promoting a false stereotype. From commercials and advertisements to Halloween costumes, quote, human trafficking is mainstreamed into culture, end quote. With these false perceptions of human trafficking, society is missing out on opportunities to protect these trafficked people who need it the most, specifically healthcare workers and law enforcement. Trafficked people interact with these groups on a regular basis, and just one interaction with a trained nurse or police officer can save someone from their life of trafficking. Lastly, the cyclical nature of poverty repeatedly puts the same groups at risk who are trapped in chronic poverty for many years and will often pass it on to their children. These social systems perpetuate human trafficking and the poverty and inequality that is closely intertwined. The ethical arguments for this topic should be clear. If we believe that there is infinite intrinsic worth and dignity in every person, no person should be able to own, buy, or sell another person. Some argue that trafficked individuals, at least initially, chose the life they are living. When force, fraud, or coercion are added to the equation, autonomy and free will are no longer being honored, and these actions are not morally permissible. The difficulty lies in passing moral legislature. This may sound complex, and while it is, quote, all laws legislate morality because each dictates the moral and ethical behavior of people as they dwell together in a community, end quote. The next step would be to determine what legislature is morally permissible. Is it morally permissible to punish people for crimes they were coerced to commit? Is it morally permissible to punish people for crimes they commit out of necessity in an attempt to escape the cycle of poverty? The issue exists that in a society where we are all equals, if one person has a price, we all have a price. There continues to be a counter-argument to survivor support programs and movements to decriminalize prostitution for the trafficked that these individuals are at fault for their actions and should be held responsible for their life choices. To frame this point, the same argument was made 20 years ago about women who were victims of domestic violence. In that time, quote, outsiders judged that she chose to stay in the situation and deserved the treatment she received. But through education and awareness, we now understand what occurs for the women mentally, end quote. The same sequence must be followed in today's society to grant understanding to survivors of trafficking. To add, saying that these women had a choice denotes that they had multiple viable options and could choose freely between them. For the majority of human trafficking victims and survivors, none of that is true. Theresa Flores lays out this argument nicely as she states, quote, the words option and choice are the opposite of slavery and human trafficking. If we judge that a person has an option, then it cannot be slavery. But bondage can be unseen. Bondage is generally psychological as well as physical, end quote. It is not a matter of options, but a lack of options, financial or otherwise. Human trafficking may seem to be an issue so vast and embedded in society that it is impossible to eradicate. However, this is not true. By eliminating the causes of human trafficking, we can combat it. By changing the mentality of sex buying, we can eliminate the demand and traffickers will have no reason to supply. In Sweden, a partial decriminalization model was adopted in the 1980s where sex buyers were persecuted and trafficked people were offered exit care. Now there is a generation of men in Sweden who think of prostitution as a human rights violation. This generation is not partaking in sex buying. If we can pass legislation to promote care for survivors and persecution for Johns, we will be on the right path to eliminating demand. In addition to legislator, there's a lot that individuals can do to educate themselves, to be observant and notice red flags and protect their children. Each of us can, quote, make a difference starting with protecting ourselves, caring for our family, and supporting those in our circle of influence, end quote. Another piece we can inform ourselves of is purchasing fair trade products. There are many databases online that provide information about organizations' labor practices so we can choose to support the ones with just practices. Conversely, as products made through labor exploitation are often cheaper, they will often be purchased more frequently, especially by low-income families. To combat this, more stringent regulations must be imposed on these big corporations. Starting with ourselves, we can work to eliminate human trafficking. Overall, human trafficking and poverty are closely tied as traffickers target the most vulnerable for exploitation. This may be people experiencing homelessness, runaway children, parents in financially dire situations, or a child growing up in poverty trying to make a future for themselves. Victims of trafficking face serious physical, emotional, and mental long-term detriments from their trauma. As we strive for a society free from exploitation, we must remember to educate ourselves, protect those around us, and promote policies and programs that act in the best interest of people.